All right, so we are going to be talking about the civil rights movement in the 1960s. In the last section, we covered the 40s and 50s of this movement, kind of the roots and origins of the movement. Now we're going to talk about the 60s as the movement kind of reaches its pinnacle and the kind of final push to end legal discrimination. Not to be confused with ending all issues of race, but ending the official legal discrimination is obviously a massive step towards equality in the United States. All right, so I want to start off basically talking about this in chronological order. So February of 1960, despite making some progress in the late 1950s, it's still the simple truth that black Americans are experiencing prejudice in their daily lives in the entirety of the U.S., but it is obviously worse in the South. It's not restricted to the South, and I want to make sure that we understand that. Now, this incident on February 1st of 1964, college students go to the lunch counter, which lunch counter, kind of think about it like, it's kind of like a coffee house today. These are kind of smaller restaurants, and they would have lunch counters where you could go and sit down and get a sandwich and get a drink and eat, and then you get up and leave. So basically, it wasn't like a restaurant. It was just basically a bar top. You know, come as you want, you sit down, you order your quick sandwich or something like that, not anything major. You eat your lunch, you leave. And it's kind of sit yourself. Well, at the time, African Americans are going to be denied access to these lunch counters. These are not available for African Americans. And so on this day, February 1st, you have 4 students who are going to decide to go in and sit down and say, we want to be served. Now, the lunch counter says, I'm sorry, we don't serve you. You're going to have to leave. And they refuse to leave. They said there's no reason that you should not serve us. And they decide they're going to take a stand against segregation. So this happens in Greensboro, North Carolina. Over the next several days, hundreds of people join their cause. And this becomes known as the Greensboro sit-in. Some people are arrested, charged with trespassing. Protesters launched a boycott of all segregated lunch counters in that area until the owners of these lunch counters are forced to cave. The original 4 students were finally served lunch at what was called the Woolsworth lunch counter, where they had first stood their ground. And so this was just kind of an act of civil disobedience that we are not going to allow you to discriminate against us like this. Okay, and here's what some of the protests outside look like. I want to note that there's something here that it's important that it brings enough attention that about this discrimination and racism. Unfortunately, though, it's not going to bring it to an end everywhere, right? These people, although they are sympathetic to the cause of the African Americans, you can see that you have ministers, you have white people, black people, all kinds of people that are doing this. It's going to take really some major civil discourse to actually accomplish full desegregation. But there are obviously white people that are going to join in this cause, other ethnicities. I think it's an important point because it shows that there is a united front and that racism in any form is not just one directional. So we do want to point out and give some credit to the idea that there were other people from other races that were also backing this. And while it doesn't immediately cause an impact, without that united coalition, none of this would have been possible. So obviously, what they're doing in Greensboro is inspiring other people in other places. And it's going to launch the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC. All right, we call it SNCC. The movement is going to encourage all students to get involved for civil rights movement. And it's a really important point about the civil rights movement is that it is really spearheaded by young people. Think like the Little Rock Nine, like we talked about before. This was a civil rights problem that is basically spearheaded by 9 black students going to Central High School. College students, they're the ones that sat in the Greensboro, Woolsworth. So a lot of young people are the ones pushing back. for this change. This sit-in is also going to catch the eye of a young college graduate named Stokely Carmichael. He joined SNCC during the so-called Freedom Summer of 1964, which was, during this Freedom Summer, they had this push to register black voters in Mississippi. In 1966, Carmichael then becomes the chair of SNCC and gives a famous speech in which he actually originates the phrase Black Power, which we will come back to probably in the next section. But just kind of connecting the dots here, where the Black Power movement kind of gets its origins is with Stokely Carmichael through this SNCC movement.
I was wondering, do you have the module 11?
The next major series of events are the Freedom Rides. At this point, there was another organization called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE for short. In 1961, CORE undertakes new tactics aimed at desegregating public transportation throughout the South. So we've had transportation and education. These are the whole thing. This is what this whole thing is rotating on. Now these tactics become known as Freedom Rides. And Freedom Rides, the first Freedom Rides take place May 4th of 1961. 7 African Americans and 6 white Americans take part in this. And there's really another important point that we had this mixed group fighting to end desegregation. What better group than one that is already representing both main races as part of their whole, right? You can't fight against desegregation if you're in a segregated organization, right? That would seem kind of counterintuitive or a little bit of hypocrisy. But 7 blacks, 6 whites leave Washington, D.C. on 2 public buses bound for the Deep South. You see on the map here, it's showing you the routes that they intended to go. They wanted to test the Supreme Court ruling that was in a case known as Boynton versus Virginia, which declared segregation on interstate buses and rail stations unconstitutional. So if the bus is going to go from one state to another, you could not segregate that bus anymore. And so this Freedom Ride, this ride was meant to kind of put this issue to the test. And test if the southern states are going to kind of play along with the ruling or not. Because remember, one of the sub-themes that we can kind of go back to is that even though the Supreme Court is ruling things, like Brown versus Board, where you can't segregate education, the South is not listening to them. They are not doing anything about enforcing these rulings, right? Like 10 years after Brown versus Board, almost no southern states have integrated their schools. And so they want to actually see if these states are going to actually enforce the Supreme Court ruling or if the federal government is going to actually enforce it. Well, you could probably predict what happens at this point. The first few days, the riders encounter only minor hostilities. But by the time they get to the second week, when they actually get to the South, it goes sideways. Like really, really sideways. They are severely beaten outside of Anniston, Alabama. One of the buses is actually burned here. They set one of the buses on fire, like they firebombed the bus as it's going. In Birmingham, several dozen whites attack the riders only 2 blocks from the sheriff's station. Okay, that's crazy. They're only 2 blocks away from the police station. And they swarm the bus, get them off the bus, and beat them to a pulp. I believe they killed one of them, actually. They hit him with a rock, kill him. 2 blocks from the police station. The police do nothing about it. It's absurdly stupid. But it's because these protesters against the bus rides knew the sheriff wasn't going to do anything about it. And so it's pretty sad that this is going to lead to the intervention of the U.S. Justice Department. And most of course, Freedom Riders were then most of them were evacuated from Birmingham to New Orleans. One particular person on this trip was a man named John Lewis, and he was a very famous seminary student. And after this, he ends up becoming a congressman. He actually stays in Birmingham, and so there's all of these people that are going through their determination and their effort to end this. They actually kind of become celebrities and kind of get their names to be known and bring attention to the cause. And in the case of Lewis, he actually ends up becoming a congressman because he's committed to finishing this fight. this is an iconic image that comes out with the core leaders deciding that letting the violence on this trip are going and being violent on this trip would send the wrong signal to the country, right? The whole point is to test whether the southern states are going to enforce the Supreme Court ruling, and if you respond to violence with violence, it kind of undercuts what you're trying to do. And so they say that they are going to not fight back, and they are going to actually, these two guys, John Lewis, he says, we're actually going to be reinforced, and we're going to actually finish this trip. We're going to get all the way by bus to New Orleans, and they're going to try and finish this. So they go from Birmingham once again to Montgomery, where they had already had the bus boycott. But when they get to Montgomery, again, they are savagely attacked by more than 1,000 individuals. Again, they are trying to end the desegregation of buses. And they knock out people's teeth. They're covered in blood. The police are basically indifferent to this, and it's an alarming and obvious sign that the federal government is not going to actually do anything, or that they haven't done anything. And it kind of sends out an alarm to the rest of the country. It prompts national outcry of support for the Freedom Riders, putting pressure on President Kennedy to end the violence. And we'll talk about Kennedy in the next module, though. But it does put pressure on him to do something about this. And that the riders are going to try and continue to go through Mississippi. They've endured through Mississippi further brutality, imprisonment, obviously generate more publicity. Dozens more people joined the Freedom Riders by the end of the summer. It had gone on for months. Protests had spread to train stations, airports. And by the time you get to November, you have the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is going to issue rules prohibiting segregated transportation facilities everywhere. And so these Freedom Riders are going to have a very long and brutal fight, but it's a very good example of the kind of courage and fortitude to stick with these things that it is going to take to actually get substantial changes made. So, again, it's going to eventually culminate in the ICC prohibiting segregated transportation facilities, which is a huge step forward as well. All right, that brings us to 1963 through 1965, a series of important civic marches. In Birmingham, there were peaceful demonstrations that the African American community underwent to sort of spotlight segregation and also kind of highlight this peaceful, non-violent protesting. The one in Birmingham is broken up by the police with attack dogs and fire hoses. They actually are, to be hit by a fire hose is incredibly painful. If you've ever accidentally used a pressure washer and run it across your foot on accident, it hurts a lot. Now think that times 1,000. I mean, fire hoses put out a lot of water and they're very, very painful. But it's recorded and the nation watches, and it seems to be totally over the top use of force to end a peaceful demonstration. There is another one in Selma, Alabama. Selma to Montgomery. It's a protest of voting rights. This is again broken up by the police, and we're going to circle back to this point that we made about, in the 1950s, you have news TV and television stations that are showing these things live. And so what you could read in print, a picture says 1,000 words. What does a moving picture say, right? More than you can describe. And so, of course, people are seeing this in physical motion on their TV and going, what have we allowed to happen and take place in the South? And it's really finally bringing real attention to this. And so the March to Selma gets broken up again by the police. And it was really awful and very, very brutal. Then you have the all-important March on Washington on August 28th of 1963. And make sure you note that the March of Washington, they call it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. and it was attended by 250,000 people. They called it the Million Man March. It was really about 250 to 300,000 people. But it was the largest demonstration at the time ever seen in the nation's capital, and one of the first to also have extensive television coverage. Now, there's not a slide for this, but I want you to take note that 1963 is a particularly powerful year for the whole movement. One of the reasons is the March on Washington. This new media coverage, it's bringing attention to Birmingham and Selma, and you also have the disbursement and public reading of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. It was written after he was arrested. I believe y'all read that in one of your classes. No? Yeah. And he was written after he was arrested during a protest. He's advocating for peaceful civil disobedience against unjust laws. And there's another dozen or two demonstrations throughout the country, California, New York, and they all are going to end up culminating in this March on Washington. So just keep all of that in mind as we say that this is not just in the South, but it's a coalition of several civil rights organizations, all of which have slightly different approaches, different agendas. But the big organizers are CORE and SNCC and people like Martin Luther King Jr. himself, who leads the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. John Lewis is going to lead the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, like I said. Philip Randolph, who leads the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Roy Wilkins, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Whitney Young Jr. of the National Urban League. All of these people have major roles to play in the civil rights movement, getting meaningful civil rights legislation, eliminating racial segregation, and bringing attention to police brutality against demonstrators. There are things that maybe at a little smaller scale but really important, like laws prohibiting discrimination in public hiring, $2 an hour minimum wage, and this gets put in place. You have President Kennedy, originally discouraged the march for fear that it would make legislatures vote against the civil rights laws, but the march would go on, and labor unions supported it, and basically, all of these people, despite all the efforts that they made against these organizations, the civil rights movement was a success. There were some who didn't feel like the civil rights movement went far enough. You had people like Malcolm X, who, instead of calling it the March on Washington, called it the Farce on Washington. The more radical African Americans who want even bigger changes, like the Nation of Islam. Some of these groups did attend in the march, but they also would then take that and then use that to build their own groups. Later on, you're going to end up with like the Black Panthers, and once you get to the Black Power movement and stuff like that. But obviously, when you have 250,000 people marching down the streets of Washington and they go out and stand on the mall and in front of the Lincoln Memorial and listen to the speech given by Martin Luther King. It's nationally televised, internationally. You have all these major leaders. You have Jewish leaders, labor leaders, female leaders, and obviously the most noteworthy speeches were John Lewis and Martin Luther King Jr. Lewis represented SNCC. He was younger, more radical group than Martin Luther King. His speech he planned to give was kind of curtailed beforehand because of the other objectives. The other participants said, "John, your speech is a little out there. It might drive people away." Martin Luther King very famously gives his "I Have a Dream" speech, right? Which is a really interesting story because he actually, that was not the speech he intended to give. He wrote the first half, he gave the first half, and then he kind of just got overcome by this thought process. The whole "I have a dream" part was kind of off the cuff, believe it or not. He kind of folded it up. Interestingly enough, there is a guy that's like, he's really involved with like the NBA, if you ever watched the movie Air, he was actually at the March on Washington, and Martin Luther King like gave him his handwritten speech from that day, and he still has it. It's kind of a crazy thing. Like, so Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is actually like in the possession of just some dude, which is kind of wild. Maybe one day it'll be like in a museum or something, but right now he's just like, it's at his house, well, or probably in a safety deposit box. But obviously, this doesn't end the movement, but it does push it into another phase. So then we have things like the ghetto uprisings that we need to look at as well. This left, you have Harlem in 1964. The one on the right is in Los Angeles in 1965. It's just days after one of the main bills was passed, where 50,000 people attacked police and firemen. They burned down businesses, doing about $30 million worth of property damage. And so the unfortunate truth here is, I think, really something about human nature, where we have, the peaceful protest, but I'm 100%, sure that that doesn't always satisfy our desire for our anger, right? The peaceful protesting. And so you end up with a lot of damage and quite a bit of violence in reaction to some of these things, in reaction to this civil rights movement as well. At the end of the day, there's two major laws that you need to know for quiz or test purposes. They're the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. Civil Rights Act of 64 simply banned racial discrimination and segregation in public employment. So it bans job discrimination based on race, religion, nationality, and sex. It's a lot like the earlier executive order on the government's part, expands it throughout the country and makes it the official permanent law. It's ratified in Congress and signed into law by the president. And then the Voting Rights Act of 65, which said no test or device was allowed that would deny anyone the right to vote. So that's why when you go to vote, you don't have to take a test. And some people sometimes want these back, but they don't really realize what they're asking for. Like, people are like, you should have to pass an IQ test to be able to vote. Okay. That's real generous about what you think your IQ might be, right? Like, then you start putting that stuff in, and all of a sudden somebody doesn't want you to vote. Oh, sorry, you're 1 point under the IQ line for this vote. Sorry, right? And so obviously that's not going to be good. But this is an iconic photo coming up here that this is President Johnson following Kennedy's assassination, which we'll cover in the next module. But Martin Luther King Jr. on January 18th of 1964, they meet. It's kind of at the peak of their powers. The country is in the middle of its own kind of maelstrom. And this is, less than 2 months following JFK's assassination. And basically, JFK had just said in his union, no memorial or elegy is too, or Johnson said that no memorial or eulogy more eloquently can be done for Kennedy's memories than the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. And he fights very hard, and he kind of launches this campaign to end poverty, and ultimately this work is important that the president is taking, but King wanted to meet with him, wanted to be actually able to shake the hand of the president. And that was a huge thing. And so this kind of is the culmination of the legal fight for the civil rights movement.